First of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you particularly for the invitation for this particular topic. The word exploring in the title of the course was immediately attractive, and the idea of the road less travelled as well. I hope to go even a little bit further perhaps than is expected, and not simply to reverse the theory practice into practice theory, but to try to do something a little different. I tend to think of theorists in one world and practitioners in another, therefore theorizing in one world and just practice in the other, and whichever direction of travel you see between the two, I don't like the idea of the separation. What I want to do is to bring theorizing into practice. And I don't want to do it as something new, I want to do it as something which is what teachers do already. It requires, I think, a reinterpretation of what we mean by theorizing, and I'll get to that later. But I think that's the most important point I want to make, that I think teachers and learners theorize all the time in their practice, and I want to include learners as practitioners of learning, just as we've come used to thinking of teachers as practitioners of teaching. And I want to think of both of them as spending their time in class, not only when things are good, but when things are not so good, theorizing in the sense that they are trying to make sense of what is going on, trying to understand what is going on. And perhaps the only problem is that we're not naturally necessarily very good at finding ways of working to understand what's going on for us so that we can make the most of the situations we're in. So when I talk about exploratory practice as something that is perhaps new, and has got a special contribution to make here, I think the contribution is simply that it is trying to do something to help people be better at the theorizing they are likely to do naturally in their lives, but we all have to do in our lives to try and make sense of the lives we're trying to live. I should apologize perhaps in a sense because my entire academic career was academic, obviously. I cannot claim to have been a practitioner except for the first 2 years of my career when I was teaching in elementary schools and adult evening classes in Sweden. After that, I became a university academic. And what I'm essentially saying is I think, in some respects, that has not been a fruitful thing to have people like me with a minimum of experience actually going into academia and trying to work with theories, trying to imagine theories from practice, certainly, but then trying to pass them on to a next generation. I think there have been huge flaws in that process, one of which was perhaps a shameful one. I believe historically that the growth of master's programs in TESOL, in applied linguistics generally, needed theories in order to make their subject a respectable one at master's level. So theories had to be there, you had to theorize, you had to intellectualize as an unfortunate way of putting it, but that I think is what has happened. We had to intellectualize. I had to intellectualize teaching method so that it became possible to put it alongside linguistics as an intellectual challenge to MA students. There's a pretty bad history there, I think, of finding yourself over-intellectualizing in order to impress students that something was complicated. And then trying to theorize over it, which is essentially a matter of simplification, and then expecting people to go away and somehow get back into practice and be able to do a good job. That's by way of a miserable sort of introduction. I want to put practice first. I want to start, however, with a story of practice rather than talking just about practice. Then a little bit more thinking about theorizing and what I think has gone wrong, and what might help put it right. I want then to show you some pictures of what are called the Rio EP events. Rio de Janeiro and the Exploratory Practice group there that has an annual event where teachers and learners get together to share with each other the work for understandings that they've done in the previous year. It's a fascinating event, and I hope to be able to show you a good many pictures of it. And then a bit more about theorizing up and down perhaps, but I perhaps will have to skip that for lack of time. And then something about the special contribution of exploratory practice, which I think is most easily put up in one word: trust. I think what we have been able to show in the work done, particularly in Brazil, but elsewhere in the world as well, that trust is such a hugely important element in relationships between learners and among learners, between learners and teachers. And I think that's where exploratory practice has helped most, by helping teachers and learners establish good trust relationships. And finally then, if theorizing means working for understanding, then that is far too good to be left to academics alone. Let's all do it, learners as well as teachers. The story I want to start with, I think for me it's a very attractive story of practice in Rio. Eleni Santiago is the teacher. I'll read it in case you can't see from where you are. In the beginning of this year, I was in a quite difficult situation because I had to face an 8th grade group that has been seen as the worst at school, principally in relation to discipline. After some bad moments together, I was quite irritated and could not stand the situation. So I decided to start some work based on an exploratory practice principle, using the subject I was dealing with according to the course plan, must versus should. First point I'd like to make here then, she was following the exploratory practice principle of integrating the work she was doing for understanding with whatever the curriculum demanded of her at the time, not stopping teaching language for the sake of trying to work for understanding, but working for understanding through whatever she was going to do to help them learn the language. The starting point was a brainstorming considering quality of life, immediately linked to the quality of life in class, one of the EP principles. It's been another, I think, discovery for us that, relatively speaking, technical problems in classroom are unimportant. Technical problems about what particular teaching technique to use for a particular piece of the language and so on. What seems to be much more important is the quality of life for people as learners in a classroom, as teachers in a classroom. How they are working together as individuals, how they become a group or don't become a group, and so on. The following moment, in Brazilian Portuguese, its translation, so the next step in my English was to write sentences using should or must regarding the role of students and teachers in class. I collected the sentences made in groups, and in the following class, the sentences were shared with the whole group. On that day, they had the chance to write their comments about our work and future life in class, taking into consideration the sentences made by them. In addition, they could try to guess what my initial puzzle was. Why am I so irritated when I have to teach face the 807 group? She didn't tell them that, but she was, in fact, immensely irritated at their bad behavior, she told me. To my surprise, my terrible group was able to understand that it was necessary to improve our life in class, and really took part in the talk and process of understanding what was happening. So already we have a sense of trust, which you wouldn't expect from the way the class actually had normally behaved with her. Simply by raising the issue with the class, it seems she was beginning already to establish some trust with them. They realized that the responsibility of having a pleasant class needed to be shared. It was not only my own concern. She adds, also, they helped me realize that I was partially responsible for our bad relationship, because I was unable to listen to them. After 3 classes sharing ideas, we could understand that respect from both parts was necessary. Also, listening was part of our life in class, although we were not exercising this ability. I can say that we have grown with this simple way of understanding something that has made us so uncomfortable in class. Now we really are a group. Our life in class is much better. I'm very fond of that particular story. It was published initially in the Rio de Janeiro State English Foreign Language Teachers Journal. And that's it, the total article. It's all she needed to say what she wanted to say about that. She's now doing a master's course in language pedagogy in Rio. I like very much that story. I like the way that she was very quickly able to appreciate the more human side of things rather than the technical side of trying to find ways of engaging them. She engaged them by showing an interest in their own perspective on life in the classroom. What more can I say? I think this is an example, a minimal example perhaps, of what it can be like for teacher and learners together to be working for understanding in class. And I want to say that that is, for me, a sort of theorizing, working to understand. Working to understand, I don't like my title, Theorizing Up and Down. It's not a happy one for me at all. But what I mean by it is theorizing up or down is a matter of trying to understand something. Theorizing up in the traditional way, as we're told was natural 21 years ago, you start with the idea of going upwards to develop a theory, and then you have the problem of coming back down again. It's what scientists do, it's what scientists are supposed to do, it's what academics are supposed to do. They're supposed to reflect on everything they can observe and from that get a theoretical perspective which can then be turned into useful guidance for later practice. Theorizing down for me, what Eleni and her students were doing, means looking for what I would call a livable understanding. What the scientist is supposed to do is coming up with not a livable understanding, but a stateable explanation. Something in terms that anyone could understand. Words, in other words, that make sense to people, that actually do constitute an explanation of the phenomenon they're trying to look at. On the contrary now, I am saying, I think what it makes more sense to do in practice is to theorize down in the sense of looking for understandings that you can live, that help you live, even if you can't tell people exactly what it is that you've understood. I don't know how common it is here, but the way I was raised and trained to be a teacher, it was made very clear to me that the best teachers are very often totally incapable of saying anything useful about what it is they're good at. They just don't have anything to say. They are just brilliant teachers. I can remember in, I think, '84, we had America, Britain and Canada conference and workshops, summer program in Teachers College, Columbia in New York. We invited several well-known teachers who were considered to be exceptionally good teachers. We had them come up to us, stand before the audience and answer our questions. And the main question was, what is it, do you think, that makes you so successful? None of them had anything to say. I mean, they told us, I'm sorry, I have nothing to say. And the only one who tried to say any more was the one who said, well, I keep on getting my contract renewed. So I must be doing something right. I want to argue that people like that have a livable understanding. They have understandings that they can live. They are such profound understandings that they could not possibly put them into words. They know that to put them into words is to destroy them, to make them look much more simple than the reality is. That's a very important point for me. It's what Eleni Santiago was doing. I think it's what we all do all the time anyway. All our life, we're not trying to explain everything in a way that is going to be useful to other people. We're trying to explain it to ourselves in a way that we can live, make life a little bit more tolerable. It's something we have to do all the time in all our interactions. It's a human thing to do, it's a social thing to do, it's not a scientific thing to do, if you like, but it is the way we have to live. So the main problem with theorizing up, as I've said already, is coming back down again. If you have a theory, it is necessarily the simplest possible statement of the world as the theoretician sees it. To get back to practice, not necessarily, but typically and historically, results in a simplified form of whatever practice it was that generated the theory in the first place. So we have the behaviorists in America in the wartime, just pre-war, 1939-45, and doing their thing, developing audiolingualism, but they were people doing it. When it got theorized and put into textbooks, only the simplest parts of what the audiolingual pioneers were doing could possibly be put into a textbook. Nobody said, you've got to have lunch with your students, which is what they had in the early days. They had to have lunch in the students, and they had to have lunch in the language they were teaching with their students. And it failed in the end because they got married and really didn't want to have to go in and have lunch with students anymore. It was a very human thing that destroyed audiolingualism, if you like, in that respect, in practice, but also the fact that the textbooks that circulated around the world could not possibly carry the richness of the audiolingual experience as it had originally been invented. It got theorized up, and then coming back down, and all you end up with is pattern practices, if you're not lucky. I remember meeting Robert Laddo one time in the early 70s. And Robert Laddo had been such a pioneer of it, he said he was in despair because he always included communicational exercises in his units, but no teachers ever seemed to get to them. They were too busy moving on to the next bit of pattern practice to notice that he was trying to get them to actually do some communicative work in class. I've been around an awful long time, and I'm very tired, but this is sort of 40 years of this, and it keeps on happening. Bill Littlewood, in his abstract here, has pointed out how communicative language teaching has also got simplified. People thought about it in communication theory terms, people thought about it then in terms of communication method terms, and then it comes down to people saying, well, that means we don't teach grammar anymore. That means we have to do speaking all the time, and so on. And it becomes absolutely crazy. I want to avoid that, basically. So take it out of that cycle of up and down and say, stay down in practice, do the theorizing within practice. Can you see that? This is theorizing, I think, in practice in Rio at the 2009, in fact, exploratory practice event in Rio. What you see there is a part of a huge room of poster presentations, nobody making any speeches. A very big room. There were, I think, 200 learners mostly from schools, a few university people. The youngest were a group of 8-year-old children, right through then to postgraduate students. You see mostly more older ones there. And they had been working on exploratory practice in their classrooms, came together, as they do every year, to share by posters the work they had done for understanding. Not to share the products of their understanding, not to say, now we understand this, we'll tell you all about it, but say, this is what we have done to try to understand what's going on in our learning lives or our teaching lives. This is a teacher presenting his to some learners. Are my students really learning was his initial puzzle, and then why do my students think they do not know English? Which is an interesting puzzle for teachers to have. I think they're learning, but they don't seem to think they're learning. How can I persuade them that they really are learning? This is nice, I think. It's a teacher. These would not be his students, obviously. They would already be working on it with him. But this is a teacher explaining to other people what he has done to try to understand better why his students think they do not know English. This is children discussing the teacher's poster. The teacher is in the back, but you can see she's on the side. They are in front looking at it and studying what she has done. Difficult to see what her initial puzzle was. This is just a group of learners with no teacher in sight at all. They don't need a teacher to be present at this, although they have all done their work at the instigation of teachers, typically. We have only one example of a learner calling for exploratory practice work in the classroom, reminding the teacher that He wanted it to happen. Normally it's the teacher who initiates it. So that's the first view of the event. So this is the culmination of a lot of exploratory practice work in the classroom. Learners get involved in this in a variety of different ways, but this is the story of one girl, Mariana. Says, "Hi, my name is Mariana Pompilio de Souza. I'm 15 years old and was Solange's fish student in 2005 at the Albert Einstein School. I was from the 804 class. Once the teacher asked us to do a task in which we had to discuss and put into practice some questions about the classes in the school that we'd like to investigate. Like, why did we have to wear an orange uniform? Why didn't we like to learn English? Why was it difficult to pay attention to the school classes? And why do teenagers get pregnant despite all the information about contraceptive methods, etc.? That was astonishing. I mean, these are not questions about being a language learner particularly. These are questions about being a learner in class and being a young person in a school situation. And that last question was in fact taken up by a group. And it was because one of their classmates had had to leave school because she was pregnant, heavily pregnant. I mean, not just because she was pregnant, but because she could no longer come to class. She was so heavily pregnant. And they were worried about that. And they wanted to have a look further to see what had happened. Some years later, I went back to Rio, and who should I see at the Rio event that year but one of the girls from that class who'd left school, where she'd heard about the event again and come back with a poster about what had happened to her since that time, and her trying to understand how she, in fact, had ended up getting pregnant too, and was not too worried about that, but she was still working on trying to understand how is this in the lives of learners in Rio. Everything was normal. That is critical to me. Normal in the sense that this was not something weird that the teacher was doing. This was integrated in the normal teaching practices of Solange Fish. We did the tasks, doing researches, filling questionnaires, interviewing students and teachers, preparing posters and presenting to the class. These tasks were tasks the learners would invent for themselves, doing the researches, deciding who they want to go and talk to for the interviews, making up a questionnaire to take around to other people in the same school, to home to grandmothers, to mothers, fathers, and other people, and so on. But it didn't finish this way. I mean, with evaluation and grades. So it wasn't normal to finish. We didn't have the evaluation and grades we normally have. The teacher started to talk about exploratory practice and asked us if we wanted to participate in the EP event. A few people got interested on that, and I was part of this group, thank God. The first time I went to the EP sessions, we debated our questions. What she means by EP sessions are the planning sessions for the EP event. The children are invited to join that as well. So it's a group of learners and teachers getting together to decide what they should do at the event. The last time I was there were about 30 different schools from around Rio that actually came and brought children to the event. It was very interesting because I liked to show my opinions. The sensation of being among several teachers is great. We could say that we think about our questions and they heard us without criticizing us. They could understand us and explore our opinions, respecting them above all. And the snacks during break time were also great. They have a tradition of bringing cakes to all their meetings to make sure people feel that it's been rewarding in that way as well. She says, I think I like everything and I intend to keep on practicing EP questions for a long time. It's interesting, it's the sense of it. Not practicing EP, but practicing EP questions. I intend to keep on asking questions, is really the sense of that, I think. After that, bringing back to some of the people at the event, the person on the left, some of you may already have come across in various parts of the world, Inez Miller. She's the very special driving force behind exploratory practice in Rio. I first met her, I think, in 1990 when I was in Rio, teaching a class on basically action research. And I got disgusted with myself because it seemed to be entirely the wrong model. And we were then trying to find out a better way of coping. The basic problem for the teachers was burnout. They didn't need action research to add to their burdens. They needed a way through burnout. And this provided a way. I found teachers saying, at last I realized why I like being a teacher. Again, I feel good about being a teacher. She's the driving force behind it in Rio. I visit when I can, but she is the person who has been leading the development with the team, call themselves the Exploratory Practice Group, Rio de Janeiro. This is a much older person than we've seen previously, a student teacher in his poster about internships in 2010. The person in yellow there is Ines Miller's best friend and best support, I think, Bibad Cunha, major collaborator in the Rio EP group, with some older learners and no poster. It's just a forum for people to get together and talk. And here was a very pleasant surprise. The rector of the university where these events are held came down to have a look himself. Now, we didn't expect that level of support and interest, but it's very nice to see that the rector of the university was actually there to talk to the learners as well as the teachers about the work they've been doing for understanding their situation. You'll see the labyrinthine pattern on the t-shirts. That is the sort of signature logo of the exploratory practice people in Rio. Practically every year they produce a new t-shirt with a different color, but use that labyrinth or some other similar design. The labyrinth being a sort of puzzle that you walk your way through. And there's some other of the founding mothers of the group. Maria Parno Velasquez Braga, Solange Fish, and Isolina Lira. The person with the great smile, the second one, Velasquez Braga, is the most fantastic teacher. She no longer says she needs a language curriculum. She gets it all out of the exploratory practice work. Whatever the learners need to learn, they will learn from all the work she does with them, investigating issues in their lives as learners. But we have Isolina in the check shirt, a retired person who has been going for many years in retirement with us all. And it's just interesting to see the range of people that get involved. But it is women, clearly, mostly involved. I think I'll bypass all this lot. It will appear in the paper eventually. That was a little bit more about the theorizing thing, and I don't know that we need that anymore. Let me talk a little about exploratory practice as a set of ideas about what to do, which are illustrated in what Eleni did. Start with a why question, basically, not how. How we don't find a productive way. If it's a how question, then rethink it into a why question. You'll probably get further with your work for understanding. For an example, something like, how can I stop my learners resorting to Portuguese when they should be practicing English? It's not very helpful. You can think of countless techniques people have used that haven't worked. Think about why do my students do it, then ask them why they do it, and there's a better chance of reaching an understanding. It was, in fact, the first example I heard from a Rio teacher before I'd even made the suggestion myself. She had had the problem. She asked a group of learners to talk amongst themselves in English about the problem they had of staying in English. And the problem just went away. Because having talked to each other about it, this was a private language school with parents paying for extra time of their children to go to class after school. Not a very motivating situation for the children. They were tired already. But having talked amongst themselves, she said they were amazingly good at discussing the situation for themselves, and they sort of collectively and silently seemed to decide to try harder in future not to break off from English and use Portuguese instead. So it's a sort of technique that begins to solve problems without actually thinking of them as problems, but thinking of why things are happening. Discussing that seems to help people get a livable understanding that helps them live the next part of their lives. So start with the why question, investigate it using normal classroom procedures. Mariana kept on saying this was normal or this wasn't normal. Grades were normal, but we didn't do it. But otherwise, the activities were normal. Alini used the normal bit of the syllabus to investigate what she needed to try to understand better. Then work with others to mutually refine thinking. It seems to be enormously important to people to have other people to talk to so that they can try to think as well as they possibly can. It's clearly not possible for many teachers to find other people, like-minded people, who are willing to spend the time talking to them. And we do have some very distinguished examples in the published work on exploratory practice of people who have simply read a paper about it, got on with it themselves and done it, and cooperated with the learners, but not actually had other colleagues to talk to about it. But it does seem to be enormously helpful if you can find other people to help you refine thinking. I think all researchers find thinking as well as they possibly can is, in a sense, the major problem. And it's just in a slightly different context now, trying to get people to think as well as they possibly can, however badly that is. I'm extending this to learners, and I want to argue that the learners with the least intelligence deserve to be stretched as far as they possibly can to use every bit of understanding they can, not to listen to other people explain things to them, but to work out for themselves how they can possibly understand what is happening to them as language learners. Then try as a group to articulate understandings, but not to formulate a definitive explanation. That is bound to oversimplify, bound to fail to actually capture the essence of the problem if it really is a serious issue. If it's just a technical matter, okay. But if it really is an issue in the life of people in the classroom, then trying to come up with a definitive explanation is not going to work. And then, I'm not sure I'll have time, but another story I would like to get to is of learners investigating why they cheat in the classroom. You don't come up with an explanation of why people cheat. That would take forever to explain why people cheat. But you do get, from looking at it, a sense of understanding it that may help you avoid cheating in future, may help you be better cheat in future if that's the way you go. What seems to be the mistake is that looking for a definitive explanation rather than looking for an understanding that you reach at by some sort of discussion with others, but not consensus, not trying to make sure everybody agrees, but simply discussing it as far as you possibly can until you can go away in thinking that you've developed your own thinking as far as you possibly can. That, of course, requires the sixth point. You trust that you'll be able to live your deepest understandings even if you can't state them. I think it's unfair to go back to the story of the exceptional teachers. It becomes unfair to ask them to explain their success. It just can't be done. You can't pass it out. We had an enormous movement in TESOL when I was president of TESOL for a while. There was this enormous problem of competency-based instruction. And it always had the risk that it would be the minimum required to manage a class without getting assassinated by your students. It was not a way of explaining and understanding the really good teachers around. You could miss good teachers, they could fail on the competencies and still be exceptional teachers. It was a whole movement that really was quite frightening to me. So, I think this does help us understand the paradox of excellent teachers who have nothing to say. They have a deep level of understanding that I said before that they can live, but it's so deep they should not be expected to be able to find words for it. The problem with theorizing down, but nevertheless a reason for optimism, is that if you get understandings that you cannot communicate because they're too deep for words, that makes them sound utterly useless to anybody else. And that, in a sense, is the case with the excellent teachers. You need to live with them if you're going to find out what it is that helps them be excellent teachers. Live with them in the class, at least. Spend time with them and so on. They're not going to be able to tell you, so it's, in a sense, it is useless unless you can share their life in some way. But I think we can find important value in understandings that are too deep for words if we fully adopt participant research. I've spoken over the last few years mostly about practitioner research, but I want to add this third category, which is well known. I'm not trying to invent it. We have academic research, which is third-party research on other people leading to universal understandings, which I've said is really the problem. We have practitioner research, which traditionally has become first-person research, leading to highly local understandings, but just for the person who did it. If we have participant research, multi-person research, collective research of people trying to work with each other in order to reach their own personal understandings but reach collectively, then I think we have a better chance. Now, Zeleny finished her story. Now we really are a group. Our life in class is much better. So I think there is a value in sharing this sort of local research, but not sharing the findings. In fact, it hardly makes sense to talk about findings. Sharing the processes of doing the investigation. Well, who did that? I didn't think I did. Yeah, I will try to get into this Carlos Magno's story. We have 10 minutes, I guess I can. My name is Carlos Magno. I was Valesca's student, Valesca Braga in the photograph, in Santo Tomás de Aquino Municipal School. I've just finished the 8th grade and going to high school now. My classmates presented a lot of posters. My favorite one started in an English class when the teacher announced we could present a work in the EP event at Puki is the Catholic University in Rio. We started thinking a question to investigate, and then I had the idea for a poster, why do we cheat? And that is the poster. You can see it's got Portuguese on the left-hand side and English on the right. Why do we cheat? We interviewed our classmates and teachers. We got some amazing narratives. How the cheating is prepared, what happens when a student is caught cheating. We found out that some people don't cheat but help others cheating. Most teachers said they cheated. They cheated. There are lazy students and there are those who work hard and don't have time to study. For some students, the subject is difficult to study and learn and they cheat. For others, cheating is a habit. They cheat since they were little. Good grades are important. No one wants to fail. We all agree that cheating is wrong. Students have to study. It is important for our future. So lots and lots of complicated ideas there, not one simple explanation that you're going then to use to alter practice. Just a lot of thoughts you need to have to cope with the idea that people cheat. Then we also noticed that a lot of people misbehave outside the school. There are a lot of wrong things happening, and we may compare them to cheating in tests. We read some articles from the local newspapers showing people parking their cars on the sidewalks, people throwing papers and cans through the windows, on the streets, the elderly being disrespected, so many wrong things. When my group presented the poster at Puki, many teachers mentioned that their students also cheat. The teachers congratulated us and said our poster made this is a very complicated sentence, and said our poster made the curiosity of knowing why their students cheat emerge. I understood that sometimes the students cheat because they don't study and are not prepared, but sometimes we, the students, get nervous and go blank. And the PS was, I invited learners to write up stories, and this was one of them. And one of his colleagues, Daniela, wrote a PS to his talk. Carlos doesn't like speaking in public. The presenters of the poster were Daniela and Patricia. So he didn't have to go to the event and actually present it in some way, just had to be there and talk to people if they wanted to. Then the teacher's account, Carlos Magno went to our EP meetings and presentations, but he refused to present any poster. I loved it when he suggested a new puzzle, why do we cheat? I was telling the class how much I hate to give them tests. I simply can't avoid them cheating, and it's a waste of time to prepare, to correct, and etc. And then Carlos said aloud, teacher, why don't we do that EP work? Fantastic. I asked them to look up the word cheat in dictionaries. We all laughed when we compared the results. We read in the Cambridge International Dictionary of English that anyone caught cheating will be immediately disqualified from the exam. In the Nove di Aurelio da Lingua Portuguesa, the example is, one shall not pass the math exam without cheating. Valeska is very keen that her English teaching should also be cultural teaching. She's very pleased when this sort of thing arises in class so that she can help learners appreciate their own culture and the cultural difference with others. I brought them an article from the internet telling ways of cheating. They read, we commented and got some ideas. They started collecting narratives of cheating, how, when, why. They talked to teachers and students and even to their families. They came with fascinating stories. We laughed with some reports and sympathized with others. Parents who beat kids up, lack of time, injustice. So many sad realities. Right, I'll go back to that for a moment. I don't know what impression you've got of the learners. The learner's English is the teacher's English. They wrote in Portuguese and she translated. So the complexity of the language is a teacher addition to whatever she thought the learners were trying to say in Portuguese. Don't think this is the level of English of these students there. Secondly, it would be relatively easy to get the impression that we are dealing with private language schools and relatively affluent Rio families. Some of the teachers are rich. It buys them time. They have a maid at home. They know that their husband is going to have a meal ready and she doesn't have to do it, and so on. But one telling story from one of the teachers about how trust had been established and she felt it really was true, it had happened, was that, as was typical, her learners are very poor, and she had seen one of her students dipping his hand into a trash can, trying to find something to eat. And she said before she had been working with them in this way, she would have crossed to the other side of the road rather than catch his eye and let him be shamed by it. But this time, he just looked up and said hello. And she said the same, and it was a huge relief to her that there was no longer this problematic relationship of these extremely poor people being treated in this way by their teacher. The respect was working and coming through both ways. I'm very pleased that I heard that story because it was not obvious. Finally, I want to talk about what I think is the major bonus of exploratory practice. I've mentioned it several times. The establishment of trust between participants. Many years ago, I had a really excellent PhD student who was from Brazil, but working from Israel at the time, Hadara Perpignan, who did her PhD on correcting postgraduate student writing, PhD students' writing, helping them develop their writing skills. She thought she was going to invent a new, efficient way of marking up learner writing so that they could easily make the improvements necessary. She discovered in the end that the only thing that seemed to make a difference was the establishment of trust between herself and the learners. These were learners she never met. She was on a correspondence course, the Open University in Israel, so she had to establish trust in writing. But all her research on it ended up with the conclusion that what was necessary was that the learners trusted her to be acting in good faith, and she trusted them to be acting in good faith. Then no matter what she wrote on their paper, they would work to improve it and would be able to use her help. If she hadn't established the trust, then somebody many years ago did some work on feedback and said, well, learners just don't take any notice of it, basically. No, they know it's not going to help them. They think it's not going to help them. So theorizing, I think, the final thought, it's far too good to be left to academics. Our practice itself can be a process of theorizing. This is a way we've captured it, exploratory practice, an indefinitely sustainable way, because it's fully integrated into the practice. For classroom language teachers and learners, not only language teachers, but it's easier in language because you have to find something to talk about. In geography, it's more difficult to find time to talk about learning lives than it is in a language subject, while getting on with their learning and teaching to develop their own understandings of life in the language classroom. A picture of the university entrance in Rio. It's a lovely place. The buildings aren't particularly pretty, but it is a very nice, calm place to go and have these events. And Valeska Braga is not doing something new. This was something I found people doing already. And what we're doing is trying to help them do it better. Is understanding what we already do, and this gives us a lot of pleasure. And then Felipe Gedges asked if we would continue with EP after school. I went to find him in Rio. He was working in a bank. Not, I'm afraid, as a sophisticated bank clerk, but as a runner, running errands for the bank. His father had not allowed him to go to college. He didn't pass his subjects well enough to automatically go, and his father didn't want him to stay at school. But Felipe said, of course I will. It's something for the rest of your life because it makes studying easier and less boring. It makes learning easier. I'm working now. I finished school. And I guess I can use this idea in my work too. Try to change the way of doing things that I may think are boring or difficult. Believe me, it works. Another thing once he said was, you don't have to eat a book in order to learn something. It's a nice, memorable phrase from him. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.